Hello, welcome to this webinar about introducing 4 speakers who will talk about their ideas in presenting economic concepts for the K-12 school curriculum. And we have 4 speakers today. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes. We will not have questions in between. We will allow all 4 speakers to speak for 10 minutes, and then we will have questions afterwards. And keep the questions coming for as long as you like. Some of the speakers may need to leave at the end of the hour, but we will keep recording as long as there are questions. Our first speaker, I'm going to introduce all 4 speakers first. Our first speaker is Murat Gökalp. Hello.
Yes. Hello.
And he is a teacher, an international baccalaureate curriculum for mathematics and economics. And he is currently, I believe, are you in Singapore right now?
No, I'm in Shanghai, in China.
Oh, Shanghai. I'm sorry. Shanghai.
No,
so it's very late for him, but we are happy to have him with us. So he actually teaches economics at the high school level. Our next speaker will be David Wheat, who is a professor emeritus from University of Bergen. He is a professor of economics and system dynamics. We welcome David, who will speak to us second. Erda Gersek is a professor. Emre, would you remind me the university that he teaches at, or maybe Erda can tell us the university? He is,
I teach at Koç University in Istanbul.
Okay, Coach, thank you very much, Erda. And his specialty is also economics, and he uses system dynamics in his instruction. And Khalid Saeed is at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, also in a program that specializes in economics and system dynamics. Those will be our 4 speakers in that order. And Murat, we would like you to go ahead and start your presentation. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, I'm teaching economics, basically 101 and 102 in the university level, you can say, with 3 major units. So I'm going to write those units. One is, you can say, micro, which consists of foundations of economics as well. And then macro and global. Now, the interesting part of the IB program is that you can insert a huge unit on development economics. And I have a personal preference here. I insert development economics in between micro and macro. So this development economics, and with a new update on a unit on behavioral economics for HL students. HL is higher level. In IB program, there are standard level and high level students in the same classroom. So the level of economics is a little bit beyond Econ 101 and 102 by these editions. So this is a kind of framework that I've worked with. And I have to give you a background information about my students. My students have never, ever learned anything about economics. So I have to develop the foundations and the basic concepts with them. So they don't know anything about like demands, or they don't know anything about opportunity costs. So an introductory unit is just focusing on these. So, so this is a kind of framework that I work with my K-12 students. Now, one of the questions is, I think I answered this one a bit, from micro to macro, macro to micro, etc. But there's a room for teaching development and behavioral economics in this context, in the syllabus of IB. Now, what might be the fundamental stocks in an economy? I think I will focus on this question, flow cycles. I identified 2 flow cycles that you can work on later on. One of the main focus in K-12 economics I teach is circular flow model. And it's a very simple idea, as you know. So on one side, there are households, and on the other side, there are businesses. And there are flow of leisure time from household to business. In return, there's a flow of business to household, goods and services, in very simple terms. Now, there are 3 major assumptions here. 1, no government, which means that there's no tax at the introductory level, and that gives teachers a room for scaffolding about K-12. 2, there's no international trade. 3, there's no financial sector or banking system. Now, when I introduce this idea, the students at least have a basic idea of how things are running in a flow in the economy. There's a second step. Then I introduce government taxes and government spending. Then I introduce banking sector about loans and savings. And then I introduce finally the international trade. Now, this model also helps us to develop macroeconomics, because at the end of the day, when I introduce government and international trade, I'm also introducing the components of aggregate demand, like consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. So that this model also helps me to develop macroeconomics in the coming terms. And the second interesting flow model, I think, is poverty traps. As I told you, in economics, there's a huge component of development economics. And in poverty traps, there's a generational flow of unfortunate transmission of poverty from one generation to another. And in very simple terms, again, you start with low income of the family in the first generation. Then this leads to low education of the second generation and health services. Because of low education and health services, low efficiency of the second generation. And this causes low level of output. And because of low level output, it ends up in low income again. So this is a very rough definition of poverty traps. There are different versions of that, but I think this is a great example for flow in economics. Now, I identified some stocks, and I think that will be interesting. I'm taking a concept called tradable permits from market failure. So there's a unit that I teach that the market does not function, does not do its job, does not provide us quantity and price. And tradable permits are actually is the right to pollute the environment. And carbon dioxide emissions is a good example for that. And the idea is if the firms can trade tradable permits between them, and if the government issues a fixed number of tradable permits to the markets, then eventually the government will have a market-based tool to find a solution for the carbon dioxide emissions problem for the environment. And in that case, since the number of tradable permits is fixed every single year, then the supply of permits is a vertical line with infinite inelasticity. So this is the supply of permits. It's a fixed number. And it looks like to me stock here. So this is the quantity of permits. And this is the price of permits. And there is demand for permits. So this is the price P0 and quantity Q0, and this quantity is a fixed number. Now, can a historical approach starting from hunter-gatherers be used in teaching economics? To some extent in my program, I can use that. First of all, I introduce the basic difference between the command economies and the capitalist system. And I introduced my students how 3 questions of economics is answered in how do we produce, what do we produce, and for whom we are going to produce. And my students understand that at the start, if we are in a command economy, usually central planners are answering these 3 questions. And if we are in a capitalist system, then usually these questions are answered by the market. And in a mixed economy, there's a kind of combination of both. So that's one approach. And in international economics, I'm introducing the idea of comparative advantages and absolute advantages. And therefore, I can start with early days of trading between humans from history. So there is an approach that I can use some historical facts or history itself to teach economics. And in macroeconomics, I am teaching the 2 main approaches of schools of economics, like Keynesian approach versus neoclassical approach. So for example, I can teach 2 different aggregate supply curve. One is more like, I think, a flow because it has stages. I can draw the Keynesian approach here. So in the Keynesian approach, there are 3 stages where first, the prices are not increasing because there are abundance of resources. This is real GDP. And this is price level. Then some resources are running out, so the prices of those resources are increasing. Therefore, there's a slight increase in the prices in the second stage, and the economy reaches its full employment level. So Y star is the full employment level. How much time do I have?
You have about 1 more minute.
Okay. This is the Keynesian approach. And I'm going to draw the neoclassical approach, which is just long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, and it tells me that it's another stock. Again, real GDP. And price level. I think I can stop here. and I'll be very happy to hear your questions when everybody finishes.
Thank you very much, Murat. I know 10 minutes is not very much time, but we are just trying to get off the ground, and we appreciate what you have presented very much. If you would release the screen.
Sure.
Our next speaker will be David Wheat, and I want to allow him to get started with his presentation. David, you want to share your screen?
Yep. You see that okay?
Yes.
All right.
We can see it.
So as Diana mentioned, I've had a long history with University of Bergen. I guess been a part of that system dynamics group for over 20 years. And over the last, well, almost the same amount of time, I've been doing some work in Lithuania, teaching a monetary policy course every September, a month-long course. And then the last 11 years, I've also been working in Ukraine, and that project is ongoing as well. I have 2 or 3 classes that I teach to students in Kyiv and in Lviv. So that's basically what my day job is, you might say. But and I should also mention that the work with Ukraine has many aspects to it, some of which is policy oriented with the government in Ukraine, some of which is strictly research and teaching at the universities and develop capacity. But one of the things that we have done, and Diana's aware of this, is we started having teacher training workshops in both Kyiv and Lviv over the last 3 years. And our focus has been on STEM teachers who are interested in learning system dynamics and using that with their students. The focus has just been on teacher training and making the software available. And of course, we're very pleased to hear the recent developments at IC Systems about making Stella Professional Online available to K-12 schools around the world. And so I've already talked to my colleagues in Ukraine about getting that started, making sure that they have access to that software. Much more, a much better experience than, let's say, working with Stella Online, the much simpler version. But I think maybe what's more relevant to our conversation today is that going back even to the period before I went to Norway, I've been teaching in a small community college in Virginia. And that started, and even to this day, is an adjunct position. It started when I was had my consulting business going on in Virginia, and started teaching part-time at this college, and was teaching macroeconomics. And this was in the late 90s, when I was sort of struck by the fact that my students, somewhat like Murat's students, seemed to have never seen economics before. They arrived on the college scene, and they would turn the page of the typical macro textbook, and they encounter the word model almost every page. And most of these, of course, are static models, just diagrams that don't really move around until some professor stands in front of them on the board and pretends to be dynamic and moves things around and that sort of thing. So I could see their frustration. They had no idea how the model on page 25 related to the model on page 75, and it was just a mess to them. So I sort of committed my life, or at least my academic life, such as it was at that time, to trying to develop a new way of teaching and learning economics. And I got sort of hooked on the idea and decided to move to Norway at the age of 55 and become a student again, and became a PhD student at the University of Bergen. And when I finished, I was asked to join the faculty. And so that's how I ended up staying there for so long. But my dissertation was about that process of using system dynamics to teach macroeconomics, which is my specialty. I also would mention that Diana and I have had conversations a number of times over the years. And about 2 years ago, she introduced me to one of her friends who's a high school teacher in California, teaches a very advanced group of students at a private high school there. And I've been invited to give some online lectures to those students. And I'll mention in one of my slides, so maybe in a moment, what we did there and how it worked. One of the things that concerns me about the challenge of introducing system dynamics into the economics curriculum at the K-12 level, is that with the exception of IB programs and advanced placement programs, the quantity and the quality of economics in the K-12 systems, at least in the US, is almost non-existent. Now, if you can look at some statistics, the last ones I saw, that more than 45 of the states now require that high schools offer economics, and that's good. The quality of the courses and how they get offered is questionable. I think more interesting is the fact that only 21 states actually require students to take those courses. So you can imagine there's a disconnect between the requirements to have them and actually taking them, and then how they're delivered is another question. So my own experience with working a little bit with that level of student is that it's important to try to integrate the economics with courses that already exist. If you try to develop a new course and change the curriculum, if you don't already have an economics course in existence in a high school or a middle school, it's almost impossible to get something like that adopted unless there's some real exogenous event that comes along and makes that happen. So my stealth strategy, I suppose, is to try to integrate, or I would recommend trying to integrate economic history and into the traditional history program, and also to take advantage of the math and science classes to discover the power of system dynamics modeling could be useful and insightful in math and science classes. And as I go along, if it sounds like some of the things I'm talking about would be way over the heads of the students at certain levels, I'm certainly aware of that. And obviously the details of what I'm talking about has to be somehow take into consideration the cognitive level of the students that in each level. But I think this idea of a combination of a high-tech, low-tech approach where we build on the curriculum that already exists and try to make inroads there. And then at some point, if we're successful, or I should say, if any individual school is successful, maybe they'll have an opportunity to break it out and become a standalone economics course. That would be the kind of course that students who never would qualify for IB programs or AP programs could actually take. So in the, as far as the economic history and the math and science, I obviously would have to think about the distinction between lower and upper grades. And I would think that micro concepts are more appropriate at the lower grades, where the younger students can really identify with people working and getting a paycheck and going to jobs and paying taxes and that sort of thing. And then the macro in the middle and high school. But there's a way to teach micro concepts that then translates quite easily into the institutional sectors of my macro models. So I find that transition pretty easy to explain. And then in the once you get to the high school level and the middle school level, and I think economic or American history is usually taught somewhere in the 11th grade, maybe a year before or a year after, but sometime in that range. And there's usually a world history course somewhere late middle school or early high school. So there's plenty of opportunities to focus in on those periods in history where economic issues were paramount. And the key policy issues, of course, would be unemployment, inflation, taxes, debt, and catastrophic as well as sort of run-of-the-mill kinds of behavior going on in the economy. The idea there would be to just develop a working knowledge of the terminology and the issues. And I think strong preparation in time series graphs, percentages, percentage change, working with equations, again, integrating with the math and science classes could help prepare students for dealing with economic concepts and modeling later on. So when we get to the SD modeling at the high school level, what I would suggest is that we, first of all, make use and build upon what we've been stressing in the earlier grades and take advantage of a lot of textbook and media statements about what's happening in the economy and implicit cause and effect, and to get students to start thinking in terms of drawing these causal links and loops, somewhat like the loop that Murat drew a moment ago. And they don't have to be accurate. They need to serve as a basis for communication. And in fact, getting those out on the screen and asking students to explain the logic and the rationale of the loop, may result in a complete redesign of the loop and a redesign of their mental model of what's going on. But I think that's a very useful task. One of the things that I really emphasize in the macro courses I teach, and I teach macroeconomics at the graduate level to students at the University of Bergen and at the Kiev Mohyla Academy in Kiev, and even Franco University in Lviv. And there I always emphasize that what they have learned before in their macroeconomics courses before they get to the graduate level are almost totally devoid of any laws. So I think that the so-called laws of economics should be thrown out the window. And everything that we study in economics textbooks, if it's not an identity equation, is a behavioral equation that rests on behavioral hypotheses. So I think that, for instance, what Murat's talking about, teaching two different ways to think about macroeconomics, and the Keynesian versus the neoclassical, gives you many opportunities to stress that it's not the question of that one is right or one is wrong, that there are just two different sets of hypotheses, and there could be elements of truth and falsehood in both of those. And what we're looking for is a way to find plausible causal statements, and that's where system dynamics can be helpful. So trying to take these hypotheses and put them into a causal model and a system dynamics framework is not easy. It's a challenge, and yet it forces one to think about what seems to be easy statements about laws and economics are really hypotheses, most of which have not been put to the test of a robust causal model. And then as we move from that, sort of translating causal statements into links and loops, they do become a little more complex. And then at some point, you're going to start writing equations and building simulation models, and getting students to think about the positive and the negative links and how those relate to the equations and where you get the pluses and minuses. I think it's just a logical build on the math and science that they should have already learned or should be learning. And then as you get deeper into the stock and flow feedback simulation modeling, then the smallest structures would be developed first, and then you begin to show how they could be connected. So you've got households and business firms and banks and government, and then all of that then feeds in, again, sort of the circular flow that Murat was talking about. So in my macro models, the demand side of the economy drives the supply side, and then the supply side then generates the income back to the demand side. But it all happens in a way that's a seamless model. There is no separate theory for the short term and the long term. The long term is nothing more than a collection of all the short terms. And so that's the approach that I bring to all this. And then eventually, I think you need to maybe make full circle in terms of expressing yourself, start taking the modeling that you've done and put that back into words and tell what Stella calls the stories about your model. And so we start with taking text and making models, and then conclude with taking the models and making text again. And lots of practice with all of this. And let me just wrap up what I have to say by offering to anybody who's interested some suggested resources that might be useful for follow-up. About 6 months ago, or maybe a little bit longer than that, several of us on the screen right here had a meeting to talk about these very issues. And I think that Emory has captured all of that on a video that's available at this website. And it's about an hour-long video where we discuss in a little more detail how we might approach integrating economics into a curriculum where it's not been traditionally taught. I'll also mention another website that I use with I use it in different contexts for all of my courses, but I use it as kind of an organizing model for my macro courses at the community college level, because it's a very simple macro model, and it puts them very quickly at the heart of policy issues. And this is something that it's a simulation game. And so students can play with that, and then there can be a debriefing time and talk about the mental model of how the system was working behind the scenes in that game. And then you can reveal the model to them that's actually driving the behavior, and that they're responding to and playing the role of the chair of the central bank. So that's available online, and I can provide the actual model if someone is interested. And I do also have slides about the lecture I gave to that California high school. This was a class in business class at this high school. And again, it was a very high level class, and they were doing a little bit of operational research work. And I mean, way beyond what we normally find even in a senior, probably even a senior AP class in most high schools. But they seem to handle it quite well. And I'll be glad to share those slides with you. And if you have any special requests, any particular kinds of models, or you just want to establish a conversation, I like to have these conversations. So just email me, and we can have one. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That's quite interesting. I appreciate all that you have shared with us. In the interest of time, I would like to go straight to Erda and allow him to start his part of his presentation.
Thank you, Diane. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And being in the same panel with David is also very special. I learned a great deal from him over the last couple of years. All the courses that he was teaching, I audited them. I'm relatively new to ST space, but I've been practicing and teaching economics for a while, practicing for the last 35 years, I guess, and teaching for the last 12 years. I'm about to teach the Kiss of that Turkish economy course. For those of you who are actually following the Turkish economy, you can just relate to my predicament at this stage. It's going to be very, very tough. And this is like executive MBAs, really old guys like me. I mean, I just want to get one of the questions out of the way. That's when I teach Turkish economy, I don't distinguish between micro and macro. It's not a sort of a macro course per se. I just say Turkish economy as a case study. And for the last 2 years, I've been incorporating some systems sort of dynamics, causal loop diagrams into the policy part. And it's been very successful. But I must admit, when I actually teach global economics to MBAs, having actually done it for a while, now I stand in front of these bright young guys and tell them the first day something like this. I just say, I'm not going to lie to you guys. This is going to hurt. And now I feel that I shouldn't be really saying that, having perused all the secondary and high school curriculum that I received from Emre over the last couple of sort of weeks, especially the IB document that I received this morning. I think is probably from Rud. I mean, if they mastered like 10% of it, life could have been a lot easier for me at the Graduate School of Business level. But I'm still just quoting the famous quote from Kalaki saying, "I have found out what economics is. It's the science of confusing stocks and flows." And that's so true, because I spent some time trying to still introduce what's a stock and what's a flow, and GDP as a flow variable and whatnot. One of the things that just really sort of get my attention in the IB book that I was looking at this morning is the fact that they were just talking about even broader issues than what we sort of covered when we were learning things like equity and sustainability and scarcity as the main topic that's being taught. I mean, obviously there is a connection between them, but you need to know sort of the concept of sort of three-body problem to realize that you can get all of them in line. Things like that, which actually has a holistic view, is still, I think, missing. And here we are talking about these issues. I'm going to just basically start from a very different angle. That's my sort of thesis all about. It's a sustainability angle. Recently, I had a sustainability teacher from another school in Europe, and we were discussing, and I just realized that when we talk about sustainability, we only talk about sustainability as it pertains to the environment. And two issues that I think about sustainability that I sort of worry about. First, when we talk about sustainability, as I said, it's just about the environment, and second, it's overused to the extent that I keep trying to distinguish between what's desirable and what's sustainable, and two different topics. The other issue is about, because it's the environmental issue, the ecology is the main concept. I think the ecosystem is also being sort of misused, and we probably have Steve Jobs to thank for that by creating iPhone and iPad and the MacBook and calling it an ecosystem. For those of us who actually teach 3 pillars of sustainability, that actually really makes sense, because your ecosystem is a very narrowly defined concept. But when you actually realize, and this was the question that I asked the other professor, just the fact that how can sort of these pillars be independent of each other, and how can economics be outside of the environment? There is a giant environment, and society actually occupies some part of it, and inside the society there is a construct called economics, which actually helps us sort of increase the welfare of the society. Okay, and how do we do that? Through our knowledge. So if you ask me, what is the fundamental stock that we should be worrying about? It's the knowledge. Because when we talk about scarcity, okay, we just talk about sort of what we call the proximate of sort of growth issues, land, labor, capital. What is not scarce is knowledge or human ingenuity. And then you just come to this interesting point of how do we actually transform knowledge into sort of some instruments through which we increase welfare. Then you just basically face sort of the concept of institutions. Okay, so what are institutions? Institutions are the codified version of our knowledge through which we basically create sort of economic welfare, which is also an important stock variable as far as I'm concerned. So in my sort of humble opinion, it's inevitable that we need to deal with the institutions to be able to understand sort of the sort of, let's say, to have a holistic view of the systems view of economics. And when you just talk about institutions, people just sort of really sort of they turn off. And economic historian Niall Ferguson basically came up with the concept of killer apps, the killer applications, just to be able to reach out to people in terms of sort of explaining institutions. And that's why I just say these are the codified, like the little codes, okay? And in my humble opinion, again, I think we should just start with the concept of what are the institutions, how do they come about, how do they evolve or co-evolve as I teach them, and how do they disappear? And when you talk about this way, it becomes somewhat sort of daunting task, but it's not. Depending on my audience, okay, and I teach corporate economics, and sometimes I teach ship captains and pilots and janitors and whatnot, okay, from various parts of the society. And then I just, depending on the level of the audience, I start with either the Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman famed the Far and Away movie, or the recently Game of Thrones issue, sort of in terms of how people settle down and start trading, and then institutions started just emerging gradually. But I think the Far and Away is actually a bit more sort of instructive in terms of just basically telling everyone, the kids, how sort of these institutions emerge, in the sense that you just have a land rush, okay? You just got a piece of land where you put your head down and saying, this is mine. How do we know it's yours? Then you need a piece of paper, which is called the title deal you get from the register office, and which tells you this is yours. And after that, you need sort of financing. You go to sort of a loan shark to start with. This is how it starts, where sort of institutions gradually sort of move into sort of a more established structures, codified, but initially it's the loan shark. You give your title deed, get financing, and so on and so forth. And then you produce things, and then the market comes about, okay? And one of the things that we learned about the market economy is the fact that market economy literally takes anything outside the market, converts them into commodity, and just puts it in some sort of trading. Just takes forests into timber, land into property, okay, and humans into workers, which is a relatively new concept. But as going back to what Murat talked about as the circular flow, this sort of naturally lends itself to circular flow in the sense that you have once guys were working their farms and just basically exchanging tomatoes for cucumber. So that's, I think, is a very Mediterranean way to put it. But then you gradually work yourself into a more complex structure where you need to create money. It all comes out of necessity. We don't just basically superimpose these things, okay? And how the circular flow itself is not a sort of superficial construct, is the fact that at some stage, probably around the time of the Industrial Revolution, that we just basically took people out of their sort of homes and farms and put them into little cubicles. And that means going from households through what Murat said about the leisure. We give them labor, they give us money. Through that money, we buy goods. And that is your circular flow, okay? It emerges from the institution itself. And once you go into the circular flow, from there, the third thing that I actually teach my students is the concept of national income accounting, okay? Again, it sounds daunting, but I think in his book, the sort of Yamaguchi's book, what's it called? The accounting system dynamics part is very, very good and very profound. And by just basically practicing that, you're just cutting through most of the disciplines and not only learning about the concepts about economics, but also about accounting and finance all through together, which most of these young kids are very proficient at the ages we're talking about. I'm going to stop here before my time is up, I guess.
Thank you very much, Erda, for the presentation that you just gave. I will go next. You can also ask questions in the chat if you want to record them. We will talk as soon as Dr. Saeed Khalid has a chance to make his presentation. Thank you very much, Erda. Khalid, would you like to start?
Yes, let me share my screen. Okay, so everybody can see K-12 Economics Roundtable. All right. I was listening very carefully. I think I had the advantage to listen to all these words of wisdom before I say anything. And I especially recognized David's note that you got to build on existing curricula. You cannot radically change them. And actually, our colleague, Kaoru Yamaguchi, tried to change it radically. And I don't know if you know that he lost his tenure at Osaka University as a result. So there's a big constraint to sort of stick to the curricula which is defined in the existing set of courses, and then insert our tools into them so that the students can take away some better understanding. So that's the challenge. Now, I have not taught in K-12, but I've taught undergraduate courses at WPI. In terms of economics, I've taught development economics, environmental economics, and more recently, I've introduced a course on ecological systems and economics policy. Additionally, I teach a system dynamics modeling course, which is called Games for Understanding Complexity. And some of these games also have built into them economic concepts. In the ecological systems course, I'm using learning environments, which are available on the IC Systems site. And the students' homework is built around playing with those environments and answering some questions. Now, with that introduction, I'd like to describe a fascinating experience I had about 12, 13 years ago when my daughter was in elementary school, and she brought a message from her teacher that if I could come to the 7-year-old's class and talk about economics. And that was quite a challenge, which I accepted, and I went in, and those days, a big rage for children was the American Girl doll. And it was very expensive, and every child wanted it, yet few could buy it. So I just went in and I started a conversation about American Girl doll, asking them, well, how many know about it? How many would buy it? How many have it? And sort of tangentially referring to tastes and preferences in that conversation. And then we talked about the price and again, why people would not buy at the price. The price at that time was $100. And well, we discussed how much the kids would pay to buy the doll. Long story short, we had a wonderful conversation in which we learned a lot about how the market works. And we did not yet introduce the graphs, which are, to my mind, very difficult to interpret, that are used in economics textbooks. And when the economists are unable to explain anything with those graphs, they refer to the invisible hand. We instead use cause and effect relationships. And actually, there were 3 tasks. I think there are 3 tasks. There is the feedback maps and the stock and flow computations, and relating the two. These are the advanced tasks. But I was quite fascinated that talking to these 7-year-olds, and they were enthusiastic and talking about cause and effects. We actually got to this diagram towards the end of the class. And if we could do that with 7 years old, perhaps we could do that with the other classes too. So coming back to the more, I guess, advanced challenge, there are these feedback maps, which are wonderful in terms of introducing the economics concepts. And then there is the stock flow computations, which can replace the differential equations that are widely used in economics, but relating those two is a challenge. So getting back to that same feedback model and reconstructing it using stocks and flow. This is the stock and flow diagram that you come out with. And now economics texts are cognizant of both the feedback and the computational part, but these are expressed in a language that's a little bit opaque. That's the problem, in my opinion. And as far as the system dynamicists are concerned, I think we also have not done a good job connecting the two. Now, in fact, many years ago, about 70 years ago, Forrester did show us how to connect the two. And this diagram is taken from Forrester's market growth paper. And he called this loops. And each of these sausages, in fact, is a sector which contains a set of equations. And I mean, it's fascinating that he had this idea of how to connect the computational process to an explanatory process, which was the feedback loops. And what I did was I took the clusters of equations, which he called these sectors, and I programmed them separately in terms of stocks and flows, and placed them in the modules which are available in Stella. And the module map that the Stella returned was exactly the sausage diagram that Forrester had constructed. That gives us a clue about relating the explanatory process, which is feedback loops, to the computational process, which is the stock and flow model. And I say we have done a bad job in doing this because we have tried to map each element of stock and flow diagram to a causal diagram, which doesn't make sense. That's not how it was meant to be. And sometimes we have abstracted a feedback diagram intuitively from the stock and flow model. And again, the job is not well done there too. But following the guidelines that's in the market growth model of Forrester, I think we can do a much better job. Now, coming back to this simple market clearing model that I constructed with the help of 7-year-old tykes in my experience with them. If we took inventory, and this is the stock and flow structure of the inventory, this is the inventory sector, so to speak, the demand and the supply and the price, and place them in the modules, the module map will return the explanatory process, which is the feedback process. So what I'm saying is that it's a challenge to connect the feedback with the feedback maps with the stock and flow structure. And there's a guidance available in writings of Forrester about this. And we have to do this a little more diligently. Now, I cannot believe it's like 10 years since I had this conversation with Forrester. This was at a System Dynamics conference fireside chat, and I asked him about his legacy wish, and this is what he said, that I'd like to be known for having thrown out differential equations, and I'd like to be known for having completely replaced economics. And I think that he has said these two things more in more informal context. Is never shy of saying these things. But these two things set together really make a lot of sense, because while a theory is shaped by the methodology it uses, and it so happened that economics got shaped by the differential equations methodology that it started using. So both indeed need to be replaced. Now, I often use simple differential equation in my teaching to illustrate the problems that Forrester alluded to when you had conversations with him why he wants to replace differential equations. Basically, my take on this is that he felt that differential equations are not verifiable. So there was this verifiability verification problem. Now, using formal calculus, we can arrive at an elegant relationship that will give the solution to this problem, which is expressed here in terms of a differential equation. But this solution does not say much about the pattern of change. Yeah, if you know what's this function E? Sorry, it moved. Forgive me. If you know what this function E is, you can guess the shape of the pattern of growth. But otherwise, the solution does not tell you anything about the dynamics. Now, transitioning from the non-verifiable differential equation to verifiable stock and flow, again, is something that we don't tell our students. Our students do learn calculus and differential equations, and we certainly do stocks and flows, and we don't tell them how to transition. What I've been doing more recently is using a simple transformation process where I start with the differential equation and I transition into the stock and flow notation. I'll post these slides, so I'll not dwell on it a lot. And that has helped. A lot of people come back and understand how the system dynamics language is really an alternative language of calculus. And it's very important to say that because, well, they are still being trained in the traditional way in calculus, all right? Now, why also replace economics? And I said earlier that methodology is shaped, a theory is shaped by the methodology it uses. Paul Samuelson is credited with creating a text that extensively used calculus to help mathematically savvy MIT students learn economics. But this process also contributed to the creation of an abstract theory that became a runaway train detached from reality. We all know that the merger of structure and behavior needed for mathematizing economics created the overly intelligent rational agent. The theory built around rational agency then diverged from reality in which there are no rational agents, only managers working in bounded rational roles. It also sliced theory into silos that severed important feedback processes between microstructure and macro behavior. My colleague Mike Radzicki pointed out in his 1990 article on methodology for economics, the article had a Latin name, by the way, why some of the practitioners may not connect with SD as the methodology they have used has shaped the theories that they have created. And they are entrenched in those theories, howsoever unrealistic they may be, while others might be more receptive as they might find system dynamics method to be useful for representing their qualitative propositions. So Forrester's endeavor to replace economics cannot be seen in isolation on replacing the use of differential equations. That's what I'm trying to to arrive at. Now, what is the path forward? I think the path forward is here. The two replacements proposed by Forrester can, of course, not happen overnight, as indeed he said in his response to my question. A path for transforming current models into a verifiable theory must begin with replacing calculus with its verifiable form, which is stocks and flows that Forrester devised, and that we can do in the framework of the existing curricula that we might teach in economics. Mind you, this form is also different from the version. The stock and flow does not come from engineering. I've studied control theory in engineering. My first undergraduate degree is electrical engineering. And the signal flow diagrams we use in representing the feedback process in engineering are very different from the stock and flow process that Forrester introduced. So I think that there's already work being done in making this transition. So we are using simple SD models to explain concepts in standard texts. Some of us have introduced modifications. The oldest analysis I can find is Gilbert Lowe's work on modeling Samuelson-Hicks multiplier accelerator model. And then there's Yamaguchi's explanation of logic and real time in price adjustment process that you find in his textbook. There are many others. Integrating fragmented concepts in economic theory into models addressing specific problems such as poverty, economic growth, public policy. Many of us have attempted that and can be brought to the classroom. Modeling classical economic thought that preceded introduction of calculus into economics. I've attempted that, and I guess people who are teaching economic history can bring simple models of economic thought into the classroom. Modeling institutional and organizational economic models that are qualitatively described. Many of us have attempted that. Reconstructing microeconomics, I think that's the final step, that microeconomics should be reconstructed based on industrial dynamics. I think industrial dynamics is a theory of firm based on managerial operational perspective. And I have tried to outline the embedded microeconomics concepts in industrial dynamics in an article I wrote many years ago, J. Forrester's Operational Approach to Economics. I think at some point, industrial dynamics can be the basis for creating microeconomics texts. And I've had many conversations with Forrester about development economics, and in each one of these conversations, he referred to urban dynamics as a model for economic development. And I did some work on it. I have written an article on how urban dynamics can serve as a model for economic development. And I have also steered in my teaching of development economics, looking at various theories and steering towards urban dynamics as a viable operational model for devising economic development policy. So these very threads are already in place. And what I'd like to see is to get to this plateau in our teaching of economics at whatever level that stocks and flows replace differential equations, generic decision rules replace optimal decisions, managerial's role replace rational agency, feedback loops replace invisible hand to explain dynamic behavior, hierarchy between feedback loops and stock flow structure is clearly articulated. Multiple equilibria can be described as a property of multi-stock conservative systems, and system thinking metaphors replace abstract economic concepts. That's where we want to get to. I think we are on our way. We'll get there, maybe not in my lifetime, but you younger people will bring us there. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid, very much. I would like to open up for questions from the audience. If you will release the screen, Khalid, so we can see everyone or mostly everyone. There are some questions in the chat, but if people would like to raise their hands if they have a question, please feel free to do so. Murat, you need to unmute yourself.
All
Thank
right.
you.
I'm curious, when students are learning urban dynamics model at the university?
Actually, I've used the model in my development economics class. And what I do in the class is development economics is a little bit more forgiving, that you can create a structure of course in a more diversified way. So what I do is I discuss the various concepts of economic development. There is the economic growth process, then there is the structural transformation process, and I critically examine each one of these, pointing out the limitations as well as the insights that they provide. And the last thing I discuss is Forrester's urban growth model. And the model has a very physical orientation. It has in it the workforce. It has in it the capital. The capital is in 4 connected stocks, so it can get to multiple equilibria. And it has resource constraints. So it has all the elements. And the nice thing is that people act in a managerial framework in bounded rational roles. The role players are not rational agents, they are managers. And so I don't teach them how to build the model. I do not go into the details of the model. I have reconstructed the model so that the top layer is a feedback map, as I showed you in case of Forrester's market growth model. And I use it for discussion, what sort of economic growth, economic development questions you can ask, how you can test various policies, what might be the outcomes of those policies. So these are students who do not know system dynamics. They are there to learn development economics. And urban dynamics is a model for devising economic development policy. It's interesting. Before I came to MIT to do my PhD, I had some correspondence with Forrester on economic development. And at that time, that was back in 1974, he referred to urban dynamics. And later on, a few times, whenever I talked about developing countries with Forrester, he referred to urban dynamics. And that intrigued me. And I did write an article titled Economic Development, Creative Destruction, and Urban Dynamics. That's the title of the article. I can make it available if someone wishes to take a look at it.
Thank you. Thank you. In the chat, Kim, go ahead.
Sure, my question is in the chat, but I'll expand on it a little bit. So I'm referring to David Wheat's comments about his difficulty finding an attachment point in K-12 education in the US system to teach a systems dynamics informed version of economics. And I suspect there's an analogous problem in other national economic systems, but I'm not as familiar with them. And so, you know, there's 100,000 schools in the American education system, and, you know, a system with 100,000 entities in it does not get changed by going into one school and, you know, teaching one class with one group of people. And so I'm asking you to contemplate what are stronger leverage points within the US school system. And I suggested two that might be places. One is through the National Education Standards for Social Studies Education. And the other is for the current recent push to introduce data science education into American K-12, which seems to have a lot of momentum behind it. I'm wondering if, you know, if either of these are attachment points where a systems dynamics informed education has found or could find some leverage.
I can respond to that just with limited knowledge. I am aware of the two organizations you're talking about and their mission, and there are a couple of others that specialize in economics as well. And I think we should try to piggyback those and attach to the extent that that's possible. The challenge there, I think, is that, and it's not insurmountable, but we need to recognize that to the extent that curriculum is being suggested by these organizations as they try to insert into the school systems, that curriculum is difficult to penetrate with new ways of thinking about economics, and it's pretty well captured by the conventional wisdom in economics, and that's definitely true. Looking at, let's say, advanced placement, AP economics is a landmine of explosive concepts that need to be debated, and they're taught as laws rather than hypotheses. And I have some real concerns about all of that. So undoing, or teaching students to forget what they've learned, or at least to sustain their disbelief for a while, I think is maybe the most important step. And I don't know exactly. There's probably no one way to do that.
I'd like to offer a piece of information here, and that is, I do think that AP classes tend to be very constrained. Yes. Because the curriculum is so tight, and the whole purpose of those classes is to pass a test at the end.
That's right.
And a teacher feels very little freedom to be able to introduce new ideas because they're taking away from giving students practice on tests. And I know some high school teachers with very high level backgrounds in their disciplines who refuse to teach AP classes because of that restriction. And I think that works against the progress we need to make to bring these ideas into the curriculum. I think this is especially true in mathematics, where I believe system dynamics should have its foundational support, and doesn't. Because all of this system dynamics stuff is a way to do calculus at an earlier level for students to understand dynamic change. And so I agree with you. I think it's a great question. And David, I agree with your response there. There is, does anyone else have questions? Actually, in mathematics, I did not have a place for thinking about economic ideas. It was when I started teaching system dynamics that economics started coming in as a critical part of understanding systems. And I thought, oh my gosh, we really need better education with economics, because when my students were doing these models of the environment or some other things I was having them do, kind of small global climate change models and stuff like that, economics started playing a pretty significant role in that. And you're right, there is very little introduction of economics in K-12, which was part of what spurred us to try to have this webinar and these conversations. But I also agree with what has already been said, and that is it has to be part of what we're already doing, because, and the problem there is, how do you get the teachers comfortable enough with it to be able to bring it into their classroom? Kim?
So I agree with your point, Diana, that assessment can be a real problem, and the AP assessments do drive instruction. However, you know, the thing we call the education system does respond to assessment. And so, you know, rather than throw up our hands and say assessment is, you know, the problem that underlies education, and that, you know, the wrong stuff is getting taught because it's being driven by the assessment. I mean, another approach is to say, okay, we have to change the assessments. And that effort is underway in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts, you know, the people who make the Massachusetts statewide assessments are trying to put computer, you know, I mean, are looking towards the future when there will be computer administered tests that involve students working with simulations and data. So, you know, it's down the road, but, you know, when the state assessments move to having students work with data and models, then instruction will move to having students work with data and models. So, you know, I think that you have to recognize where the incentive structure is in the existing education system. And I don't know a lot about the Massachusetts effort, but I know that Concord Consortium has a grant from Massachusetts Department of Education to work on these statewide assessments. I mean, if you're interested, I could see if their systems guy might want to come and talk to this group. I can send you a link to the little that I know about that project.
I would be very interested in that.
Okay.
Thank you, Kim. And I agree with what you say. We have a project working on trying to change assessment questions that deal with more systemic kinds of problems. But to get off of that for a minute, I would like to go back to our presenters and ask if people have other questions that are directed to some of our presenters. There was a question by John Sheehan, who had to leave. He said most of the concepts that were presented deal with equilibrium economics, and how useful is system dynamics modeling for these concepts. This was directed, I think, more to Murat's presentation. Your poverty trap is a great example of causal loop diagramming. Would anyone like to talk about the question, how useful is SD modeling, since most concepts in economics seem focused on equilibrium economics? How useful is SD modeling for these concepts?
let me jump in. I think that it's important to know when, and most SD modelers know this, of course, it's important to keep in mind that equilibrium is actually a useful concept for building a model. To start with a model and say that every time I add some structure and I test that model, I expect the behavior to be straight lines on a graph is a very powerful discipline on writing equations because it tells you if you've got the math wrong. But then once you've done that, then you need to recalibrate your model and initialize the model so it's not an equilibrium to begin with, and that there are endogenous processes that prevent it from ever regaining equilibrium. And so I think it definitely can be used, and it should be used to address the issues of disequilibrium economics.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Khaled, you wanted to say something?
Sorry, I was muted. I just want to sort of a comment on what David said. Yeah, that's for building a model, equilibrium is a great point of reference. Additionally, a dysfunctional equilibrium is often a problem in economics, like income distribution, poverty traps. So the system is in some sort of an equilibrium and it's trapped in that equilibrium. And the understanding of how multiple equilibria are created and how do you get from from a dysfunctional equilibrium to a more functional equilibrium is a policy issue. And again, I'd refer to urban dynamics, which has connected stocks, and the problem it creates, problem of cities, economies it creates, is that of a dysfunctional equilibrium. And the policies that Foster describes change the distribution of units in the stocks, bring it to a more functional equilibrium. So equilibrium may not always be a perfect condition. And equilibrium, a dysfunctional equilibrium can be a starting point of problem solving in economics.
Thank you. In the chat, there's another comment that modules in Stella offer a great way to link high-level causal loop diagrams and stock flow models. I was thinking of the model that you showed, Khaled, in different modules, and that perhaps those separate modules could represent places where we could take a small piece of an economics model and perhaps bring it into a story that might be being told in a particular discipline. Kareem Shishakli from IC Systems said modules in Stella were internally known as the Khaled Saeed feature. While we considering developing it because Khaled kept insisting we do something like this for all the reasons he explained on the importance of modularizing models. I think that's another key point for K-12 to modularize some concepts to keep each chunk more digestible for students. I liked Murat's example when he started with a very simple, I think it was households and businesses cycle, and then started adding pieces a little bit at a time. I think that's a wonderful approach, again, for K-12 students to learn concepts, any kind of concepts dealing with system dynamics models. But it sounds like some economics ideas could be introduced in various disciplines using that particular approach. So I think we have some ideas here. I think David has presented a great step-by-step way to also get started is there anyone else who would like to, let's see,
Diana,
I'm trying to
could I
look.
respond?
Yes,
to just one
please
thing you
do
said?
that.
I will add one more item on my list of some resources for anyone who's interested in this idea of modular model building. And the macro model that I use and have developed over the years is definitely makes use of Stella's modules. So you can start at the high level, literally with the domestic economy and the rest of the world, and then you drill down into each of those, and you get supply side, demand side, and then you go into modules within modules within modules, and gradually get down to micro levels where you've got household decisions being made, or firm decisions, or bank decisions. And so you can't isolate these things, and you can talk about the dynamics within those subunits. And then the important thing is for me as a macro model, is to see how they connect and how they perform this overall process of integrating the supply side and demand side. And that's what I emphasize. I do a workshop every year at the System Dynamics Conference on building a macro model. And that's exactly the way we start with these modules and start filling up the modules.
And you have some of your models, I think, on the Exchange IC website.
Yeah.
People could take a look at there. I think would be a good resource. The Exchange IC.
I will add a link to that as well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? People like to make any comments?
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Now, I'm curious about the expectation of K-12 students. What is the expectation of math level from these students when you develop these models? Because I try to develop a macro model in very simple terms using just algebra, and it was even confusing for them. And another concern that that's coming from my experience over the 8 years in international schools, I'm a rare case that I'm a math teacher and an econ teacher at the same time. Most of the econ teachers are not math teachers. So if the math level expectation is too much from teachers, that's also a concern for the teacher to deliver the content that you are planning to insert into K-12 economic syllabus.
Is this Mr. D'Souza? Is that who is speaking?
I am Murat.
Excuse me, is that Lucas D'Souza Soares?
That was Marat.
Oh, Marat. Oh, I'm sorry, Marat.
No problem.
I'm sorry. I was looking at who was not muted, trying to find out who is. I'm sorry. Actually, I have found that I have also taught system dynamics to high school students, and I was a math teacher. And I found the level of mathematics, originally I thought students had to be at second year algebra level, and I started reducing that to geometry. Students normally take first year algebra in grade 8 at 14, and geometry at grade 9 at 15, and second year algebra at grade 10 at 16. And I thought age 16 was the base level because they needed a good idea of algebra. And then I moved it down. I think all they need is algebra 1. But I believe that the sequence is important. You must start them with very small models that they can get their heads around. And then what I found important was it had to be throughout the curriculum. Every month I was doing some kind of system dynamics model with them for a day or 2 class periods. When we were learning about linear functions, when we were learning about exponential functions, when we were learning about quadratic functions, when we were learning about S-shaped growth, goal-seeking functions, when we were learning about sinusoids, by the time they got to the end, they were able to deal with some fairly sophisticated models. But I found the best piece was when I taught the modeling course. I taught a modeling course for K-12 students for 20 years, a system dynamics modeling course. And I had students in there who were freshmen through seniors. So 15-year-olds to 18-year-olds. Mm-hmm. And I was using system dynamics, obviously, all the time. And those students could pick it up and they could create original models in the last 10 weeks. Find a concept, build an original model, write a term paper. So I don't think the limitation is the intellectual capability or mathematical capability of the students per se. I think it is the sequence. We need to sequence the concepts a little bit at a time and add more complexity so that they are able to learn about more and analyze and read more sophisticated models as they progress through the course. And it works. I know it works because I've done it for a long time. And I started in a school that was middle to lower socioeconomic level students. So I found average students can do this. And even my students who had less mathematical ability than average found that they liked the visual nature of the representation. It spoke to them more than the abstraction of mathematical equations did. So I believe the problem is not the mathematical ability of the students. I believe it is our ability to have students develop their expertise in stages, like we do with mathematics. We have them develop their expertise in stages.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'm kind of and I believe very strongly in this approach. So
Touché.
And it has been my experience that kids can do this.
Yes.
Actually, MRA's teachers in elementary school, they don't use numbers, but they are starting to show students and have students build just stock and flow representations of stories that they study in class. So they have done some amazing work. Okay, sorry, Murat, but I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad, even as late as it is, that you are still with us. Does anyone else like to ask any questions or make any comments or statements?
I have a follow-up question to what you just talked about, if that's okay.
Sure. Kevin, yes.
Yes. Hi, my name is Kevin. I'm kind of new to this. I liked what you said about introducing like a starter model to students and kind of building on that in layers or stages. If I'm choosing a introductory model to introduce this to students, like what should I be looking for, or what should I not be looking for when choosing a model?
Well, I think it has to provide students something they couldn't do without it. It's always, you want to captivate the students. So it either needs to be a topic that they're really interested in, and at a level that they can get their heads around. But the beauty of the approach is that it allows students to study problems they couldn't study otherwise, as easily or effectively. They need to feel empowered. I think it's really important that students build these models, that we don't just give them to the students, especially since IC Systems now offered to provide a full site license of the full Stella Professional modeling software to all K-12 schools. That means students can build this in the classroom. Any school that has internet access and technology, laptops or tablets or Chromebooks for students can build these models. I think it's really important for students to feel control over the modeling process. So what I did in my class was to give them a little bit of a story and have them build a little bit of the model and then do a little analysis, run a graph, tell me what the graph is saying, or anticipate what the graph might do, what the model will do. What will the model do? Have them predict, and then have them run the model and get the computer output. And if it's different, have them explain the difference and why they think it's different. And then to build the model pieces in larger and larger. So it's a lesson that is a storytelling lesson over a period of a class period, or a period of a couple class periods, where they're building more and more sophistication into the model and analyzing it as they go along. Because we have the maxim, always have a working model. So this follows that particular procedure. I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's it sounds like you want to integrate it so well that they don't wonder, students don't wonder why they're doing this, right? That they see
right.
the value.
It's a tool that the teacher finds valuable over the entire course of instruction, not just for 2 weeks.
Right, okay.
Sorry, I shouldn't be talking so much. Any other questions for our speakers?
I have to leave. It's past midnight. It's
Yes,
nice meeting
Murat.
you. Okay. And I have a school tomorrow, so apologies.
Yes. Thank you, Murat, for coming. It was great to have you here. Thank you very much.
You all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Anyone else have any questions of our speakers? Okay. So then I guess we should bring this to a halt. Again, I want to thank our speakers for giving us their time and their expertise about the use of economics potentially in K-12 education. I think we have still quite a ways to go, but I think we can get some things started. Thank you very much, David and Erda and Khalid and Murat, who has already left, for helping us with this presentation.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good morning.
Bye.
Goodbye. See you next time.
Good.